Win here. In today's video, we're going to go over client scripts versus UI policies in ServiceNow. So have you ever wondered when to use a client script and when to use a UI policy in ServiceNow? Now both are essentially used to control how forms behave, but they work in different ways, and there is a best practice depending on what the scenario is, what the requirement is, and when to use it. So if you are learning ServiceNow development, understanding the difference between these two is extremely important, and generally these do come up in interviews. Just so having a very clear understanding and being able to kind of provide when to use it is a very crucial knowledge to know. So in this video, I'll explain client scripts versus UI policies in the simplest way possible with some examples so you know exactly when to use each one. So let's kind of go over what is a client script. Now, a client script is essentially a script written in JavaScript that runs on the user's browser when interacting with a form. So client script helps control how forms behave dynamically. For example, you can use a client script to validate form data, automatically populate fields, show messages to users, or trigger actions when a field value changes. Now, there are different types of client scripts. And essentially it means that there are a few things that you could do essentially to trigger specific when. So let's go through some of these. So there are several types. When we talk about onload, this is essentially when the form loads. So it runs when the form loads, and an example use case is essentially automatically populating fields when a record is opened. Similarly, on change runs when the value of a field changes. So an example use case could be display additional fields when a specific option is selected. On submit runs when the user submits the form. So essentially when they click submit on an incident record or change record, then there might be some validation form before the data actually is submitted. And then on cell edit, this is essentially when editing records directly in the list view. So anything you essentially want to appear in the list view from a client script perspective, you'd essentially validate list edits before saving. So if they're essentially going to do something where they bulk load or bulk update a bunch of incidents, when they change the short description, you might want to just validate the entry, or essentially ask them to also fill in another piece of information before they do that. So common use cases for client scripts. So client scripts are typically used when complex logic is required. Data validation is required, field values must be dynamically calculated, or custom user messages or alerts are required. Because client scripts require JavaScript, they are usually implemented by developers or administrators with scripting knowledge. Now let's talk about UI policies. How are UI policies different? So UI policy is a configuration tool used to dynamically control the behavior of fields on a form without writing code. I think that's the specific point here, is without writing code. So UI policies allow administrators to apply conditions that determine how fields behave. Because essentially they are very simple in nature and they don't require scripting knowledge per se, there's limited kind of behaviors you'd want to restrict UI policies to be able to do. So out of the box, essentially using UI policy actions, which we'll go into in a moment's time, UI policies can make fields mandatory, make fields read-only, show or hide fields, and those are essentially the three main functions behind UI policies. Now, UI policies are commonly used because they simplify form customization and reduce the need for scripting. So UI policy actions. Now each UI policy includes UI policy actions which define how fields should behave when the policy conditions are met. So common actions include setting a field to mandatory, making a field read-only, showing or hiding a field, and these actions are applied automatically when the defined condition evaluates as true. Now, before we go into the key differences between client scripts and UI policies, that was a very quick summary on what a client script is, what UI policy is, and UI policy actions dependent to a UI policy. So let's go over what they look like in the tool, how you can access them, how you can see them, and essentially try to kind of recap some of these concepts by visualizing it. And then we'll jump back to this knowledge article to go through its differences, so we can essentially reinforce that. So there's a few ways to essentially find a client script or UI policy. I'm going to show you the most common way and then the most specific way, which I think is kind of helpful as a developer or administrator. So first things first, you must have admin role to essentially see these. And easiest way is to essentially go to your application navigator and essentially search for client scripts. And when you select this, it will bring back every client script. And as you can see, there's about 2,300, and it's essentially just in the out the box alone. You will have more depending on how configured or customized your platform is. And similarly, same thing with UI policies. So if I just search in UI policies, we essentially go to this and you can see there's about 2,800, and this shows everything. Now, when you're developing something, you're most likely looking at a specific table. So let's just go to how you could find UI policies or client scripts for a specific table, as it will be better. I mean, essentially you could search for the table here. So if I type in incident, it should bring back. But what you could do is do it from the incident. So I'm just going to go to incidents. So again, I'm going to search for incidents. And as an admin, if I right click between the two columns, I can essentially go to configure. Now when I go to configure, I can see there are UI policies, client scripts. So just for the first moment, we'll go to client scripts, and essentially I'll just go through this one, which essentially is inactive, and we can see it here, and we can see this out of the box. And essentially what happens here is if the priority is 1, there's a confirm message that essentially pops up to say submit priority 1 ticket. So that's essentially the JavaScript here. We can see that the type at the moment is on submit, and the UI type is desktop. So essentially we'll work on a laptop. You can do it essentially mobile, service portal, or let's keep that for desktop now. And let's just show this working. So to showcase this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go create a P1 incident now. Because it's inactive, we should essentially not get any message unless there is someone else that's triggering it, but let's go see that. So I'm going to go and create a new incident, and I'm going to make this a P1. I'm going to put in a caller. Let's put this as test. Essentially when I submit, we're going to see that it's created a P1 with no confirmation message whatsoever. Now let's go back to this client script and let's just make this active. Let's save this. Okay, let's try again. Okay, it might just be a interface instance issue, so let's just try it one more time. Okay, that's not liking that, so let's go back and let's go and find another client script, potentially one that's active. So let's go back to our normal way. So we're just going to go to the instant list view. Oops. Okay, let's take a look at this one. So essentially this one is controlling the resolution state. So essentially we only bring up resolution notes once a incident is resolved. So let's take a look at that. So essentially if I look at incident state, okay, so not only is it's not just showing it, so it shows it regardless, but it makes the resolution or sets the section to mandatory. So essentially this here is controlling it to be mandatory. So if I look here, resolution notes, it's fine, I can put anything, but it's not mandatory. But as soon as I go to resolve this and I am going to click resolve, it makes the whole section here mandatory, so I need to fill it in. So that's one way we can see if client scripts are working. Now let's take a look at UI policies. So same thing, I just went to, let's go back to the instance view and let's go to configure. let's go to UI policies, and here we can see UI policies. Now let's just go through this one, which is essentially active, I believe, and let's just double check this. I'm just going to add active flag here. Yep, okay, so field set to mandatory for all states. Okay, and we can see here essentially you can create a UI policy action to make these mandatory. So right now call ID is true, short description is true, and you can apply any conditions, but really because it's just anytime these are mandatory, there is no essential condition, so it'll apply to basically every incident. So if I essentially go to, let's go to incident list, I'm going to showcase if I create a new one, I can see caller and short description is mandatory. Now let's do one thing. We can see here the UI policy actions. We call it field name, we say if it's mandatory, and we can also say if it's visible, read only, so on and so forth. So what I'll do is I'm just going to create a new one, a new action, and let's just set this to description. So description, I'm going to say mandatory is true. Now I'm just going to quickly show right now, if we go back to the instance, as you can see here, it's not mandatory. So let's just submit this. Okay, and you can see here now it's going back to the previous page I was on essentially, and I can see description is mandatory, and that's by adding a UI policy action to essentially say also include this field into that. And that's pretty much UI policies and client scripts in a nutshell. Now let's go back for a moment and we'll talk about the key differences between client scripts and UI policies. So coding is required for client script. For UI policies, it's not required. You could essentially write some JavaScript, but it's not required, and you could essentially use those policies actions as we've showcased to essentially set a field mandatory, or make a field read only, or even show or hide a field essentially. Execution. So client scripts runs in the user's browser, and UI policy runs based on the policy conditions. Complexity. Client scripts supports advanced logic. You can essentially write some very complex scripts to essentially ensure that if someone was to add a particular comment, you can create a record from that, and you can essentially add some very dynamic behavior. For UI policy, it is best for simple rules. Essentially anything where we're talking about setting a field to mandatory, making a field read only, showing or hiding a field. There's essentially those three that you want to look to use UI policies only for. Ease of implementation. Now client script requires scripting knowledge, so it's not as simple and as easy sometimes depending on the requirement. But UI policy is very easy configuration. And use case wise, client scripts, complex behavior. Always look at complex behavior and validation, and potentially complex validation. For UI policies, field visibility and mandatory rules. That's essentially what you want to use it for. Now let's look at it side by side. So essentially client scripts, JavaScript in browser, has field validation, can use it for dynamic actions, custom alerts, and just to summarize, advanced logic and scripting. Where UI policy, no coding is required. You can essentially create UI policy and a UI policy action to essentially make fields mandatory, show or hide fields, or set fields to read only. Essentially, to summarize, simple rules and configurations. Now let's talk about a few example scenarios. Consider an incident form where the subcategory field should only appear when the category is set to hardware. Now, this requirement can be implemented in two ways. Using a UI policy can be created with the following condition: category is equal to hardware, and then the UI policy show the subcategory field. Then, this approach requires no scripting and is easier to maintain. However, you can do this with a client script as well. So an on-change client script can also be written to detect when the category field changes and dynamically show or hide the subcategory field. While this method works, it requires JavaScript and is generally unnecessary for simple conditions. However, if you added a more complex requirement on top of that, then a client script might be better tool to use or feature to use. Best practice. When configuring form behavior in ServiceNow, follow this general guideline. Use UI policies for simple field behavior, such as showing, hiding, or making fields mandatory, and use client scripts when complex logic or custom validation is required. Using UI policies whenever possible helps keep the configuration cleaner and is much easier to maintain. Now, summary. Client scripts and UI policies are essential tools for customizing form behavior in ServiceNow. Again, to reinforce one last time, client scripts use JavaScript, provide advanced form logic, and handle complex scenarios. UI policies, on the other hand, require no coding, manage field behavior, true conditions, ideal for very simple form rules. Selecting the appropriate method helps improve system performance, maintainability, and user experience. Thank you for listening. If you found this tutorial helpful, please do like the video, comment your questions, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And subscribe for more tutorials. In the next video, we'll explore business rules in ServiceNow, explained for beginners. And I hope this was helpful. Thank you. Bye.